And turn to our panel of experts for their thoughts and questions. I'm going to call first on Francis Guy, who has served as an ambassador to Yemen and to Lebanon and is now head of the Middle East region at Christian Aid. Francis, what are your thoughts on what we've heard so far? And is there anything that you'd like to ask any particular one of the speakers? Please wait until the microphone is in your hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm interested in Peter's context question, that the question itself has a presumption in it that we could or should be a global leader at all. And actually, I think that it's a reflection of the whole debate on staying in or out is actually part of our post-colonial hang-up of what is our role in the world. In fact, I would dare to suggest that the referendum itself is the last throes of trying to work out what our role in the world should be. That said, some other countries on the fringes of Europe have managed to create niches for themselves, whether it's in development and peacekeeping, like the Scandinavians or the Irish, indeed. So I was wondering whether we're in or out of Europe, what our future niche might be, given that we can't return to the past. Thank you.
I think possibly one from each side, a response rather than each of you. On the Leave side, which one of you wants to tackle that?
Niche, as you call it, is being the fifth largest economy in the world, doing the right thing, as we see it. The focus today is on helping developing countries. We should do the right thing vis-à-vis developing countries, not imagine that we can influence other people to do the right thing. We can set an example and they may not follow it. So far they haven't followed it, but it's still the right thing to do. So let's do the right thing. And as an independent country, we can. As a subordinate part of the European Union, we couldn't. And let's be clear, we who want to leave are in favour of cooperation. We're just against subordination. And you can cooperate with countries without being subordinated to them. On security, the closest cooperation is between 5 independent countries who aren't subordinated to each other. There's much less effective cooperation within the European Union. I'm not quite sure why, but that's the case.
Mike.
We've got a global language, we have got education and universities, we have a history of our country being open and trading, and we've got citizens who have got roots and family connections all over the world. That is not going to change with the referendum. But why should we damage the relationships with our closest partners and allies in Europe? Most of these countries are also in NATO, and yet they want us to stay in the EU as well as remaining within NATO. And we have a particular cooperation with France now, which is quite high level, particularly on defence, but also with regard to policing and security. And I think that will also be damaged. Why do we need to damage it? We can have the best of both worlds by being global and having good relations with our European partners and neighbours.
Simon Maxwell, chair of the European Think Tanks Group and senior research associate here at the ODI. Let's talk a little bit more about development, since that's clearly an issue that is resonating time and again. What are your thoughts, and is there a specific question that you'd like to put?
I want to ask a question about reform, but let me preface it by saying I certainly don't speak for ODI, although I used to work here. But one of the key conclusions of ODI research has been that the well-being of people in the poorest countries is more and more shaped by global issues, whether it's climate change or security or international financial systems or tax or disease or terrorism. And solving those problems helps us, but it also helps people in developing countries. And one can think of the whole development problem these days as being about collective action and the best way to achieve cooperation and collective action. Now, we have a variety of instruments available to us to do that. The EU is one, NATO is another, the UN is a third, the Council of Europe is a fourth, the Commonwealth is a fifth. And I think the question then is, why would we not have the EU as one of the arrows in our quiver in dealing with these global problems? And the reform question is about how we're going to feel after we've won the referendum on the 24th of June, when we have to ask ourselves the question, if we wanted to remain, what are we going to change? Will we have a moral authority to change something in the EU after the 24th of June? And for the people on the Brexit side, is there anything we could argue to change within the EU apparatus that would make you more enthusiastic than you currently are for delivering collective action through that particular modality?
Alison, do you want to take the first part of that?
Well, what would what would I argue to change within the EU or in policy terms? Because I mean, I think one of the really interesting debates throughout this whole referendum with individuals perhaps who have not agreed with me about remaining has been this sense, and it was just repeated, about us being an independent sovereign country. Well, we participate in the democratic institutions of the European Union like everybody else, and there is most certainly a bit of a disconnect between people and how they feel about that bit of the democratic process. So I would be very interested in a reform that helped people to participate in a more meaningful way. And, I think Westminster has had to change itself to be more connected to the people we represent, and I would like the European Parliament to be able to do that too. There are no easy answers, but I would like that very much. And in terms of policy reform, I think the biggest thing we ought to be arguing for, given Britain's role in financial services, I think our connection with across the world with different jurisdictions, I think we ought to be taking on this issue of tax transparency and doing a real service to the world to make sure that all global corporations pay their dues, because I think that has, despite everything, lost a sense of momentum at the moment. And I think post the referendum, I think if we could use all of the institutions of the European Union and all the member states to pursue that agenda, I think it's something that could have the potential to really benefit the poorest countries in the world.
Is part of what's informing your question that if Remain wins, that there's still considerable damage that's been done by having had the referendum in the first place?
Well, yes, but I also don't want us to be complacent the day after the referendum and think that's it, everybody can go back to sleep, we've done it. Because institutionally, there's a new global strategy which Federica Mogherini is about to publish. There's a review of the European Consensus on Development. There's a review of the budget next year. There's a review of what to do about the partnership arrangement with the African, Caribbean and Pacific. And nobody who works on the EU, of whom I'm one, thinks that it's perfect. We really want to do something a lot better. And I think the right position for us is to come roaring out of the blocks the day after the referendum and say, OK, we're back, and this is what we want. And we will have a moral authority. And can I just say, while I've got the floor, of course, Peter knows this very well, that we already give duty-free, quota-free access to the European Union to all the poorest countries, and very low tariffs to the remainder. There are trade issues, particularly around services, but the EU actually is a global leader in progressive trade policy for the poorest countries.
But before you respond to that, Peter, or Crispin, do you want to just tackle the issue about whether there's anything in the context of reform that might persuade you?
I completely agree with you. This referendum is a fantastic opportunity to redefine ourselves as a country for the next 40 years. It's 40 years since we had the last one. What kind of country are we going to be is actually the fundamental question. What's our role in the world going to be? And if there was sufficient weight behind your view and my view, that it's an opportunity then, if the country votes to remain, that we've then decided our destiny in that sense, and we're going to commit to these institutions to make them work, we should be roaring out of the blocks. And then with a challenging agenda for reform to save this institution from itself. And we can see the issues they're going to have to grapple with in terms of the currency, in terms of Schengen, and we've got ourselves a nice little opt-out on these key problems. So we're going to sit and watch this institution, and if we're not prepared to really invest in it following this referendum, fall apart in front of us. It'll just be a bit more, probably rather slower if we're in it. And I would accept that a decision for Britain to leave will catalyse the fact that they're going to have to face up to some of the inherent contradictions within the European Union institutions. And that's be one of the reasons why many of our partners are only too anxious, if you're the political leader today, to kick that particular can further down the road, because it's going to be immensely difficult political problems for them to have to address. But Schengen is falling apart, and the currency sits with this appalling contradiction that there's no common fiscal area to support the common monetary area. And we might think, fine, we're insulated from all of this, but we're not really. And the other elements of the common European identity around defence and security, we actively help stop. So I would be with you that this should be a great opportunity, but it isn't. And that's the problem. And we're going to be left with this, frankly, rather miserable, negative, grumpy role in the European Union, where we've actually got the opportunity, with all the strengths that Mike talked about, to actually make a really positive international contribution with a population that is supporting 0.7% on GDP, for example. So all the political parties are committed to that. Why? Because we have a great internationalist vision as a country, and we're big enough to make this work. And I would just be so much happier having a really positive role in the world than one that sees us back to whinging on about what's going on in the European Union and how it's all rotten.
Nobody has to whinge.
They don't have to.
Let's hear from Amelia Hadfield, reader at the School of Psychology, Politics and Sociology at Canterbury Christ Church University. Amelia, you specialise in European foreign affairs. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, as a Canadian, I'm delighted that everybody in the room wants to be like Canada. I infinitely support that rather than Texas. By the way, do the right thing. That's our catchline. It's on all the license plates. You can check that out. I'd like just to pick up on one or 2 points. First of all, by Crispin. I think a good deal of the UK's international status, international role, is not acquired either by accident or individually. I think it comes from its grounding over the last 50, 60 years in the European mainframe. I think that the UK's vision has always been global. But that's why it's so valuable to the European Union. That's why it is placed in such a sharp and extraordinarily valuable way. It commands, even if it doesn't have great public diplomacy, a very pioneering role in the EU's common foreign and security policy, common security and defence policy, not least by the United States. Peter, again, I'm lots of stuff about imperial hangovers. Surely it's too early in the evening for hangovers. There's a lot of expectation regarding the European Union's role and the UK's role vis-a-vis leadership and support and influence. I think there's a great need for that. There is a high degree of expectation. And in fact, we in the political sciences refer to it as the expectation capability structure. When it goes awry, we call it the expectation capabilities gap. And into that, of course, can pour a number of dynamics. I don't think that's an imperial hangover. I think that's the structure of collective statecraft. Also, you sort of talked about the polarities of development as if when we pull out, we will have all this additional choice. Development, as you know, is a shared competence. We work with the European Union and we work independently as well. So Britain could still, of course, choose where it wants to put its ODA funding.
Trade policy is not a shared competence.
Trade isn't, I said development. Crispin and Peter, therefore, my question to you is, if Brexit, what is the appropriate global role, in your opinion, that Britain should most appropriately fill in foreign and security policy? And can I ask you to comment on what you think Britain should be doing in Europe, in the European continent, from which we will not in any practical sense be divorced, particularly with regards to migration? And Mike and Alison, if I can ask you, if and when we remain, again, I'd like to push you a little bit more on what reforms, you kind of nicked my question, what reforms are needed in terms of maybe the neighbourhood policy, the evolution of security and defence, and also what education can possibly do in this country, particularly higher education, with regards to galvanising public diplomacy for the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to start, Peter, Crispin?
Forgot which of your questions was for me. Was it about our shared competencies, which aren't all shared?
No, the global role. Your for the best.
When people ask me what role I want to play, I assume they want me to pretend. Role playing is pretending to be something you're not, and that's not something I do. we should not be playing roles. We should be doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because of what effect it may have second or third down the line. So in trade, which is an EU competence, and we cannot take unilateral action, when we leave, we will be able to take unilateral action, and we should, and I think we would, because I think all three parties signed up to the objectives of trade out of poverty. And as Simon said, some of those objectives have been implemented to a degree by the EU, but on rules of origin, it's still very onerous. And it is only limited to the least developed countries, whereas America, at the same time as the Anything But Arms agreement, Everything But Arms agreement, implemented the African Growth and Opportunities Act, which was much more generous in terms of rules of origin. It had some bad features as well. Produced much greater increase in trade between African countries and America than did EBA, which produced no significant increase. So we would be able to follow better practice and implement it to the benefit of poor and developing countries instead of playing roles. Why do you want to be actors? Why not just be yourselves?
I think maybe taking metaphor just a bit farther.
Do you want to take the second, Mike?
One of the sad factors of what's happened in the last few years is because of this internal debate that we've had, we've actually neglected to a large extent the influence that we could have within the European Union. We've got fewer civil servants and officials going in to the Commission and its staff. We've got some people at senior level, but there's been a hollowing out. We send far fewer people than equivalent countries like France. And there is a sense that somehow the semi-detachment that we have is enhanced by this obsession that we've had. So one of the great benefits of voting clearly to remain is that issue is off the agenda, and we can then start taking more seriously getting good people in there to influence the debate and the discussion. Two issues that we've got to work on as a priority. We've got to make sure that the defence and security policy is developed further, because whatever happens in the US, whether it is Trump or Clinton, there is a mood to withdraw and reduce the American commitment to Europe. That is going to happen, and it's the pivot to Asia or whatever they call it, or an isolationist Trump. There is going to be a reduction. And we as Europeans have got to resolve this problem, the difficulty between NATO and the EU related to Turkey and Cyprus and other issues. We've got to give that a much greater priority. The other issue is Syria. We've got to do more about humanitarian corridors and providing support to Syrian civilians at this moment. What's happened since 2011 has been a disgrace, and it's clear proof that non-intervention also has consequences. And we've really got to be much more serious as Europeans about trying to get a solution here and not giving in to the Putin-Assad agenda.
Crispin, I wonder, given your chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, just for your comments on both of those issues, both Syria and, given that you also voted against intervention in Syria, just a response to what Mike has just said. Well,
I think we get distracted off the main issue. Mike and I rather profoundly disagree on the merits of the interventions that we've had over the course of the last couple of decades, and I think simply you only have to look at the situations in Iraq, Syria, and Libya to see the consequences. But I think that would be an interesting and entertaining diversion down that road, which we're going to get plenty of shortly with the Chilcot inquiry. And this might be a moment to advertise the fact that I hope around the same time as Chilcot, I hope before it, that the Foreign Affairs Committee will publish a report on Libya, which I hope will make interesting reading, as interesting as our report on the European Union, which is well worth a look, and a unanimous report agreed by the whole committee, trying to address to the public, trying to give them a sense of these issues on the one hand, on the other, and produce a balanced piece of analysis for people to be able to digest about what the kind of role in the world we want. Of course, other nations, our partners, all want us in the EU. And the desire to be an American, Canadian or Australian agent inside the EU for the kind of relationship they want is fine. And of course they would want us in. Our EU partners want us in because we're obviously a significant player in the EU, and the EU will be diminished without us. So of course they do. And other our trade partners who wish to use the United Kingdom with which to trade into the single market obviously don't want to disrupt the current arrangements that they've got. So of course they all want us to stay. What that doesn't actually represent is what the British interest is. And I would also argue that the long-term European interest is, as I've already said, is actually in us having a clear relationship with our EU partners, and that's not on offer if we're voting for Remain. And on foreign and security policy, this whole issue about migration and development and security and good governance all sit together. And yes, Europe does have to get its act together, and that's where I think when Mike used this expression, we as Europeans. If only the British felt like that, you would have the kind of commitment to the European institutions and this idea of doing this together. And that's the question we're being asked on the 23rd. What gets us here? And what do we feel? I think we're international. I think we're global. I think we're big enough to be global, and I would describe it as we're big enough to count, and we're not big enough to command. And we need to understand that. And if you want a picture for our role in the world, I was accused of Britain being promoting a vision of Britain as Singapore on steroids. Guilty as charged.
Let's open up the questions to the floor. Oh, Alison, do you want to say something very briefly?
Only very briefly that, Crispin, it is simply because I am an internationalist that I am a European, and I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that higher education was mentioned in the role that it's played in giving people that sense of being European, and I think that's very important. I think, I recall being in Kenya there to talk to small farmers about fair trade and the role that UK was playing in developing fair trade. But actually we spent a lot of time talking about Al-Shabaab and the threat and the role that the EU was playing in trying to support that country in dealing with that security threat. So it is not because I suffer from any post-colonial hangovers, far from it, or think that we have some kind of important role to play. It is just who we are, that we are a country that is interested in the world and what's going on, and that's why we should work with our neighbours.
Thank you very much. So just wait until you have the microphone in front of you. Tell us who you are. Gentleman over there.
Thanks. I'm Barry Johnston. I'm the head of advocacy at ActionAid. I always find myself agreeing with about 90% of what Peter says until he gets to the punchline. So just quickly on aid and trade. You've nearly got me. But on trade, while we're working our way slowly from the back of the queue with the States and trying to renegotiate our trade deals, trying to renegotiate all those other big treaties, it's hard to see how we'd be then going around offering benevolent terms to developing countries. And on aid, since Claire Short at the EU, things have moved on hugely, and actually the UK government now rates the EU as the most effective multilateral aid dispenser that it works with. That's the DFID's own reports. And as 0.7 grows, as it hopefully will continue to do as the economy grows rather than contracting, we need to spend that aid money through multilateral, so that's an important one. My question is far more parochial. We have this great exercise in democracy at the moment. We have business leaders, we have actors, we have God knows who signing on to letters, and everyone is telling us their opinion. What's the panelist's view of the fact that a huge amount of the charities represented here don't feel they have the ability to speak out on this, and that several of those who have already spoken out are already facing vexatious Charity Commission queries?
Sorry, can you just repeat what it is that the charities are facing as a result of speaking out?
There have been complaints to the Charity Commission about a number of charities who've spoken out on, I believe, both sides but primarily accusations against those in favour of Remain.
Right. Mike, do you want to take that first?
The charities issue has been quite controversial in Parliament, and there were proposals from the government which were watered down after opposition to restrict what charities can do. It's a difficult area, this, because there is an issue about political activity and campaigning, and separate to that is the charities' work as a charity. I think charities should be allowed to speak out, but I think the issue about spending money on non-charitable purposes is where the Charity Commission should step in. I think there is but charities having a voice and having a specific view that says that we do not believe it's in the interests of the people that we represent for governments to do certain things is absolutely right. This is difficult. In a referendum, however, it's not a question of the government policy. It is a vote of the population. I mean, I think it's a complicated area, and I don't want to give a kind of blanket answer that says that charities should be able to do anything, because I don't think that's right. I think there need to be parameters that are defined, and I think we have an ambiguity at the moment. That's a problem.
Feel free to applaud, it's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
I just think it's probably been enough public money invested on one side of this argument, and people who have a vested interest in a relationship with the government, where the government's taken a very clear position on institutionally where it is, it would make this debate even more unfair. And there are proper rules that the Electoral Commission are finally able to apply in this final 28 days, where there is a more balanced debate to be had around it. And of course, there are a very large number of institutions who would and charities would be leading amongst them, who have an interest. And I think it's better that the interests are then made as arguments rather than financed by the tax relief on charity or the money the charities actually receive for executing government projects on behalf of the government. So I would be I think it's entirely right that the rules should apply and that we should try and have a fair debate. What's really important is that this is a decision that stands. And if one side comes out of this going, this entire thing was fixed because everybody was able to pile in on the establishment side of the argument, and you've got half the country then left feeling this was unfair, you haven't closed this issue down. And so I think it's very important that the debate is seen to be fair.
Could I just help the questioner move the final 10% of the way? He said the obstacles were, first of all, that we go to the back of the queue in the trade deal with America. We've asked the House of Commons Library what other countries are in this queue for trade deals with America after the EU. There are none. So we would be at the end of the queue. We'd be at both ends, the front end and the back end. And he had been put up, I think very inappropriately for a foreign leader, to bullying us with a bluff. But it's irrelevant because there isn't a queue. Secondly, you said we'd have to renegotiate all existing trade deals. I'm an endangered species. I'm the only serving member of the House of Commons who's ever negotiated a trade deal, the Uruguay round. And I know something about them. And one of the laws is that existing international agreements continue even if a party splits up, unless there's any reason for either party to to demand a renewal. So there's a trade deal between the EU and South Korea. Actually, we are also parties to that in our own right. If we leave, that deal will continue unless the South Koreans suddenly want to have tariffs put up against their goods, which is very unlikely. And that would be true of all others. When the Soviet Union split up, the Soviet Union was outside WTO, it had all sorts of trade agreements. Russia and other successor states inherited those agreements very short, within days or weeks thereafter. So that's what happens. It's a complete, I don't say lie because it's just based on ignorance. It's an ignorant presumption on the part of the Remain campaigners that we'd have to renegotiate our trade deals, the existing EU trade deals. We would not. So now you're free to go the whole 100%.
Have you been persuaded?
Yeah, but just on Christopher's point, I pointed...
Sorry, can you say that in the microphone?
I made
Thanks.
sure to say that charities on both sides of the argument. And at present, there is an absolute chilling effect on charities. And it seems a little bit of a double standard that you can have so many businesses and everybody on the front page of newspapers, and when a charity sticks its head above the parapet, it gets wiped off.
The gentleman in the front here, and then we'll go right at the back over there.
My name is Jibril Fall. I'm the director of GK Partners and a vice chair of Bond. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. These are lines in John Donne's No Man is an Island. 400 years, I'm hearing the echoes here as to whether in Britain we are really European. And both Peter and Crispin sort of seem to make the point about subordination. My question to that is the UK more in love with its sovereignty than Germany, than France, than all the other new members who also have long histories and cultures which they cherish? We've heard Donald Tusk recently talk about sort of the end to this so-called ever closer union. That's the first question. The second question is...
Let's just have the answers to the first question, and then you can, and then we can come back. Peter.
I never use the word sovereignty. I talk about democracy, about making your own laws. And there are 6 countries in Europe which find the European project difficult. 3 of them outside the EU and 3 within. 3 within are ourselves, Denmark and Sweden. 3 outside are Iceland, Norway and Switzerland. What have those 6 countries got in common? The longest history of democratic self-government through elected parliaments. And we find it very difficult finding our laws made by other people whom we can't elect and can't reject. Someone once said the symbol of parliamentary sovereignty, of parliamentary democracy in this country, isn't the dispatch box, isn't the mace, it isn't the parliamentary question time. It's the removal van that comes to number 10 after the people have rejected a government, gets rid of the old Prime Minister and puts a new one in. You can't do that with the European Commission. It's been a total failure on its main economic project, the euro. Millions of people throughout Europe, particularly young people, have lost their jobs. But no commissioner has lost their job, nor will. And we prefer to be able to make our own laws, choose our own governments, chuck them out when we don't like them, which is very painful because I've been chucked out, and put another lot in their place.
Alison, do you want to say something?
Jibril, the quote continues, each man is a part of the continent, a piece of the main. And as you rightly point out, words from a great Englishman many centuries ago. I find this issue of sovereignty and autonomy a sort of strange one because I think it was Hilary Benn who said recently, if you really want to be autonomous and be in charge of yourself, go in a room and shut the door. You know, we spend all of our time as a British Parliament making our own laws and trying to find ways in the world to influence some of the things that we've talked about, be it extreme poverty or security issues and terrorism and these things. We're constantly trying to find imperfect ways to influence the things that we care about. And that quote, of course, finishes, therefore send not to find for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. A quotation that was used in that book by Ernest Hemingway about the Spanish Civil War, a conflict which people from the city that I grew up in went to fight in for no other reason than their open eyes saw no other way. So I find this whole debate kind of strange because I'm being told by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove that my views that we should be a part of the continent, a piece of the main, are somehow the establishment rather than the truly held values of the vast majority of British citizens that I know.
Do you want to come back with your second question?
Yes, just the second question is, we do hear a lot about what we cannot do in Europe, what our European friends are denying us from getting. And I'm one of also the people who work in Europe and observe this. And to me, that's at best to say our civil servants and the governments of the day who turn up there are useless in negotiating. It's not a case for petulance at let's throw our toes in and go back home to our island. It is let's negotiate better, because even if we are out and have to negotiate with anyone else, it is the government of the day and the civil servants. If they couldn't do it amongst friends in Europe, what are the chances that they would win an argument elsewhere?
Let's start with you, Mike, to respond to that.
On your point there, the British officials, ministers, representatives have played a major role in developing European Union institutions, and I'll just focus on the foreign policy side. Paddy Ashdown was the High Representative in Bosnia in terms of that end of that civil war. William Hague was instrumental in getting the sanctions against Russia after the invasion of Crimea. Cathy Ashton established the External Action Service and, as High Representative, negotiated the deal that got Kosovo and Serbia to actually at least come to an agreement. And she played a major role in the Iran nuclear negotiations and was specifically praised by Secretary of State Kerry. So, you know, we do have a big influence at the moment. And the other point I'd just quickly like to make in response to what Peter said, the European Commission is not a government. The European Commission initiates proposals that then have to be agreed by the democratically elected European Parliament and the democratically elected Council of Ministers. And the democracy in the European Union, it may be insufficient, it may be difficult, it may be slow because there are 28 countries, but the fact is the Commission do not rule us, they don't govern us. The commissioners are all representatives when they are put in by different governments. They are a quasi-civil service as well as a body which initiates proposals, but they do not legislate. And it is wrong to give the caricature. There is a European democratic process, difficult, inadequate, but the alternative would be that we would either go back to the 200 years that we've had in Europe of conflicts and wars and nationalism, or as some would argue, we'd need to go to a greater stage of direct elections in Europe, but that no nation state in Europe wants that. We all want to have this difficult process because then you have your national sovereignty within the process as well as the cooperative arrangements.
There's a truth that our geopolitics are different from the rest of our continental partners because our geography is different. We're an island off the coast of Europe. And when Peter was a rather distinguished Secretary of State, I was a humble special advisor in the Foreign Office. But I witnessed the all-consuming battle within the EU of the British negotiating position. Now, it was reasonably successful in its own terms. But we were negotiating with partners who had a different view of the project and a different view of the idealism of ever closer union in Europe. And we would find ourselves then with countries who actually agreed with us on the issue that was being negotiated, because it was going to be seen as uncommunitaire and opposed to the view of the Commission and probably Germany. The last thing they wanted to do was to risk annoying those forces within the Commission. So these countries would then cheerfully hide behind the British negotiators, rely on them to defend their position. And there has been a price of all this. Mike is right. We are influential, and we have been quite successful within the EU. But this is a long, defensive, bureaucratic battle to try and defend the rather unique British position. And it consumes the energy of our ministers, it consumes the energy of our civil servants, and even if it has been defended over 3 decades with quite considerable success at times in terms of securing the British opt-out, we've gradually, bit by bit, been driven back from our rather restricted vision of what the European Union should be. And in the successive renegotiations, our partners have allowed us to carve out this special status, but alongside all of this, the project remains intact. And that's kind of the redoubt we now defend within the EU. And it means that when we're overruled on questions of QMV and everything else, for all the reasons Peter suggested, you read all about it in the papers because of our commitment to democracy. And I just ask, is that the positive role in the world we want for the United Kingdom? And my view is that it isn't. And there is a much more positive role for us to play, free of this constant defence of the slightly different geopolitics and economics that the UK plays within the EU.
I There's time for one last question before we hear from the speakers again with their final closing.
Sure, I just wonder if I could bring the discussion back to development. And like Simon, I'm not presuming to speak on behalf of ODI, although I'm director, because we have at least 3 opinions on this for every researcher in the House. But I do think this is an area of special importance in the debate, because, you know, we have built this extraordinary cross-party consensus on Britain's role in international development. Now, the world's just adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which are incredibly ambitious, eliminating global poverty, eliminating avoidable child deaths, tackling climate change, universal access to water and sanitation. And surely the question that ought to be at the centre of this discussion is, what do we gain from coming out of the EU in relation to those goals and our ability to drive the world towards them? And what might we gain from exercising leverage within the EU? And it does seem to me there are an awful lot of areas that we've skirted over here. I mean, take the question of aid. The European Union accounts for over half of international aid. The 10% of aid that you mentioned, Peter, that goes to the European Union is funding civilian operations and peacekeeping in Mali and the Sahel. It's funding the anti-piracy operation in Somalia. It's funding peace building in the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan. Enormously important, both in their own terms for poverty reduction, but surely also for our national security interests. Let me finish. Let me finish. International trade. It's not true, as you say. I mean, the EU is not protectionist vis-a-vis the world's poorest countries any more than the United... I mean, we're less protectionist, actually, for the very poorest countries than the United States. That's not a fair example that you gave there. And actually, the European Union gives something like 4 times as much in aid for trade, supporting the ability of the poorest countries to get into the trading system, as the United States. I mean, climate change, the US has exercised enormous influence through the European Union at the Paris climate negotiations to achieve a successful outcome. Now, I for the life of me, don't understand what we lose from staying in relation to these goals, and 2, what we gain. And you know, this contrast between you can either be a pro-Remainer, or you can be, you can either be pro-exit, or you're a sort of little Texan in the heart of London. I just don't see it. I mean, why can't you be a globalizing, a global European, a European who cares about the world, who cares about Europe, and wishes to exercise British influence within the European community?
You can be, and that's the choice we face. And of course there are advantages for Britain within the European Union being able to leverage its position within the EU to then get commitment from the EU to our national goals. And there's a price to be paid, because obviously we would need to pay a price in negotiations about of arriving at that place. But it's one of the arguments to remain. And around development, it's the arguments cut. They fall pretty evenly handed. It's actually why it was easy for Mike and I then to be party to a unanimous report, because on all of these issues there are arguments that sit on both sides of the equation. On the other side of the equation on development is you get a much clearer focus from a simple United Kingdom commitment to 0.7%. We've only got the Swedes and the Dutch, I think, who approach those kind of levels of GDP commitment within the European Union. Our leadership doesn't appear to have had much effect on the rest of the other 25 partners in meeting those kinds of level of development, particularly from our major partners. And we are then able to have a clearer focus as a country, both in terms of development assistance and how it should support good governance and opportunities for those countries to trade their way to development. And so you pay your money, you take your choice. And I don't think there's a right answer on development in that sense. Where I think there clearly is a right answer is about the kind of nation that we are and what's here. And if the answer to that were European, then we would commit to make these things work. But the answer is we're not. And our position as a nation is much more qualified, which makes these issues much more difficult. And I think we would be happier playing a positive role in the world outside and sacrificing the leverage that you rightly refer to.
Thank you very much. We've got enough time now, I think, just to give the MPs the floor again. You've got 2 minutes to make your closing statements, and we're going to go in reverse order to how we did at the beginning. So, Alison McGovern first.
Okay, very, very briefly. The argument seems to be being made from the Leavers that Britain will never be a sort of European country, and therefore we have to leave. Well, I just think that is, in a practical sense, not the case. I think people are capable of having more than one sense of identity, and it certainly makes me nonetheless British to feel also part of Europe and a European. That said, we are an independent country and we are sovereign, and this referendum is not changing that. The question is, what's the level and amount and kind of cooperation that we as an autonomous independent country need to get the things done that we want to do? And I therefore think that we should remain in the European Union because there are things which we need to do, which we currently do, that we will stop doing, and we've heard lots of examples of that this evening, whether it's cooperation on climate change, security, both within Europe or in Africa. Those things are vital both for us and the poorest people in the world. And finally, I think there are things that we must now do that we simply won't be able to do if we leave Europe. I feel absolutely clear in the coming century, globalisation will still continue apace. And if we as citizens of Europe and of countries like Britain want to take on global corporations on issues like making sure that they pay the right kind of tax or making sure they treat all their workers fairly, then I think the way that we do that is in concert with others and not alone. Therefore, we must remain.
Thank you very much. Peter Lilly.
I love Europe. I did an apprenticeship in a French laboratory. My first job was working in Holland and Belgium. I've been chairman of a German company in Berlin. I have a house in France and I speak French. But Europe is not the same as the European Union. And it's possible to love, to want to cooperate with, to want to be friends with the rest of that continent without wanting to be subordinated to it. Cooperation and subordination are different things. Influence. I was asked once by a friend a sort of trivial pursuits question. Which has been the most influential country in the world over the last 50 years, apart from the United States of America? The answer, to cut a long story short, is New Zealand. It pioneered the health service, we copied it. It pioneered central banks, half the world copied it. It deregulated, half the world followed. It pioneered social security reform. When I was social security minister, I invited their minister over so that we could learn from them. It's exercised influence by doing things which have worked, which people have copied. That's a form of influence. The sort of influence, however, people are talking that you get from joining the European Union is less scope for exercising an example, but you have a voting power, 8% of the votes, and of course the power, force or wealth to help people or withhold help from people. That's a different kind of influence, and one that's, I think, less attractive. The idea that we exercise great influence within the European Union is created by ministers like me. I was guilty of it. No minister ever goes to Europe and negotiates and comes back and says, I failed. We all come back and say, it's much better because of my brilliant negotiating skills. It took, therefore, a freedom of information request to discover that since the euro was set up, which is when records begin, Britain has voted against 72 measures in the European Council and lost 72 times. That's a measure of the influence we have.
Thank you. Peter Lilly, thank you very much. Mike Gates.
The referendum is about what direction we want to take our country in. Do we wish to be both outward looking to the world but also cooperative with our European neighbours? Or do we believe that we have more influence and are better by looking more inwardly and then hoping that people will copy us because of who we are rather than what we try to achieve with others? It's a huge risk in terms of the influence of this country. We will be reduced in terms of our role, and we need to recognise that this is a choice. And part of the argument that seems to have come from, not today, but other people in the Leave campaign, is that somehow it means there will be less people migrating to this country, we will be less influenced by others, and we will be pulling back from the rest of the world. And in a continent where we have Russia in its more assertive role, where we have the potential reduction of the US role and pointing towards Asia, 500 million people in the European Union working on a cooperative basis with the rule of law in a world of uncertainty and change. This is no time to leave the European Union.
Crispin Blunt.
It would be great if there was a clear right answer here where you could peer through the fog where everyone's trying to get to the facts and go, that's the answer. There are two future roles in the world for our country that I believe are truly internationalist and cooperative and represent our values as a nation. One is to properly commit to the European project and to make the European institutions work. But we abandoned that some time ago, really for the moment John Major successfully negotiated our way out of the social chapter and the currency at Maastricht. Labour took us back into the social chapter. That might now explain some of the 72 votes that subsequent governments have then lost in terms of the qualified majority voting. But we're not being offered that commitment to that internationalism. We're being offered a defence of the semi-detached British position within this institution. And it is an institution that is going to have to reconcile the crises facing it around globalisation and sustaining its currency. And it's the same question that affects the WTO and around trade. You either advance trade, and Peter was a brilliant trade secretary, a party to the successful Uruguay round that then did more for advancing trade around the world than probably anything else that's been done before or since advancement of the GATT, or you advance your interests by blocks. There is not a right answer on all of this. So I would then bring it back to the issue of democracy and legitimacy and what people actually feel. And if people feel they're absolutely committed to the European ideal, then vote for it. But if you think Britain has a different kind of internationalism and can sustain that role in the world, that I believe that we can, and deliver those values globally, although not being able to leverage the authority and power of the European Union institutions, we could accept that would be a price, then I believe that's a role that is much more consistent with our culture, history, and our economic interests in the long term, and that's the choice we ought to make.
Crispin Blunt, thank you very much. I'm really sorry that there hasn't been more time for questions from the floor, but I think there is a reception afterwards, so people can carry on talking. What's been really interesting listening to all four speakers for me is that despite all the facts that have come out, this is ultimately, from both sides, about the kind of country the United Kingdom wants to be. And there's heart on both sides. Peter talks about a love of Europe, but not of the European Union. And Alison talks about the possibility to have more than one identity. And the idea of cooperation versus subordination has come up time and again. Obviously, we weren't going to have any answers here tonight, but I think from the cases that everyone has laid out, there is a huge amount that we can go away and allow ourselves to think about and allow it to percolate. And the one thing that I'm really very sorry about is my fault completely, that we didn't talk enough about climate change, and it's something that we should have done, but we didn't. I apologise for that. What struck me the most, actually, is that the bottom line is that it is about what Crispin says. here. It's about what you feel. And what you feel is obviously going to be informed by the facts that you've heard, some of which you've heard tonight, but also what you absorb over the next couple of weeks. So I don't really have a conclusive thought, except that I want to thank all 4 MPs for laying out their case as clearly as they have. And I'd also like to thank the experts for their input. Thank you all very much indeed. And a personal thanks to all of you for coming and for taking part, and also all of those online. Thank you very much for being with us too. I'm now going to call Ben Jackson up, Chief Executive of Bond, just to say a few final thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's mainly what I wanted to do. But I think that, yeah, I just certainly won't attempt to conclude. But I think hopefully everyone here and people online would agree that the quality of the conversation, the passion. It's possible to have passion about this debate, to talk about fears, of course, to talk about things that might go, but to do it in a respectful way, and also in a way which admits on both sides it isn't completely black and white, and is about the vision that we want to have about who we are as a country and as a people, and our relationship with the world, which is, of course, shaped by our history and our values. And I think all I'd say is that if we could have a bit more of this kind of debate about all the other aspects of the referendum debate, I think it seems to be what on every morning show, and we're saying we want more of that. So thank you so much to all of our MPs for participating, for giving up time. I know you're involved in all sorts of aspects of the campaign, so we really appreciate that. Thank you for all those participating. It's been fantastic again, of course, to do this collaboratively with ODI and to engage in these issues. And I know that many of the organisations represented here will continue to do that, notwithstanding, I don't know, Barry's not there, but Charity Commission guidelines, which of course we will all absolutely obey. So thank you very much. And I think the last thought I'd had was the point that some of our panel, Simon and others, raised about whatever happens in the referendum. I definitely think that the point that ports to all of us as civil society as well, whatever the outcome is, the kind of continuation of a sort of semi-grumpy kind of in-out, shake-it-all-about approach is not what we want. And I think in the development community, I do think there's a serious point there, that many of us over many of years have worked on European Union policy and being very critical of that, as well as looking at the positives. And I do feel it's something that we as civil society need to re-look at and re-energise what our relationship is, because even if we are leaving, there will be a long period of negotiation. What that means for development and for developing countries will be vital. So we need to stay engaged, not just in the next couple of weeks, but also beyond that. And I think we have let our eye off the ball, and I speak as hopefully a representative of the community that we need to do more of that. So thank you very much indeed for all those. Thank you very much for Razia for doing a fantastic job keeping all sides fair, I think, and thank you for all of you to come. Last thing to say is offering other people's drinks, but there's going to be a reception here, which I always like doing as a reception here, so do continue the conversation, and thank you very much indeed. Subsidised by the